I'm God late. The word from yesterday was apropos. This is chapter 31, Red Flags and Behavioral Clues. The essence of our daily existence is comprised of some form of constant thought, movement, and behavior. As human beings, we are motivated to achieve certain things in our lives, and we take specific steps and actions to accomplish these goals and objectives. The things we say and do when moving toward realizations of these goals are observable, and sometimes they help point an investigator to better understand the movement behind an individual's actions. In some of the preceding chapters, I have marked things that popped up as a red flag for me as I poured through the investigative reports that have been compiled over the course of a 13-year investigation. The pages or paragraphs are marked with a symbol that identify a statement, a piece of physical evidence, or behavioral clue that seemed out of sync with the elements that were supposed to point to a crime being committed by one or more intruders. There were initial signs that alerted me to the possibility that all did not seem right within the reported construct of this crime, and I continued to come back to these time and time again as I tried to sort out the events and comprehend the motive for the commission of this murder. Some of the same things may have jumped out at you as you read through the events that transpired over the course of this inquiry. I will leave it to your discretion if you wish to review their history before continuing to explore this chapter, but it is here that a discussion of these behavioral clues will be presented. I would note that this is neither an all-inclusive listing of things that raised questions about the existence of an intruder, nor are they presented in the chronological history of their discovery. And let me make it clear, many of these red flags were the same things that troubled Boulder police investigators during their investigation of the matter. The evolution of John Ramsey's statements make for an interesting study and will be analyzed in a later chapter. But one of the first things that caught my eye were his comments made during the January 1st, 1997 CNN interview. In response to the question from the CNN correspondent Brian Cabell about the family's decision to hire a defense attorney, John indicated that he was not angry about JonBenet's death, but he/they were interested in finding out why this had occurred. He stated that he could not go on until there was an answer as to why his daughter had died. I was puzzled by this statement and could understand why he would be asking why someone had chosen his daughter to murder, but the part about not being angry was confounding. The emotional aspect of this statement didn't make sense to me. I would have thought that all the emotions flowing through a family victimized by a violent murder, surely anger would have been one of them. As a parent of 3, I believe I would have been extremely angry if a stranger brutally took the life of one of my children. And then in context of the same sentence, he referred to JonBenet's dying as opposed to her being murdered. This section of language may be inconsequential, but the choice of this word seemed to soften the circumstances of the crime. To whom, I wondered, was this response being directed? The Ramseys received quite a bit of criticism for the perception that they were attempting to manage the media. As noted in Chapter 7, the national public relations firm had been retained early in the investigation, and a family spokesperson regularly issued press releases and responded to media reports that covered the progress of the investigation. I thought it interesting that John Ramsey tried to divert some of the criticism about the decision to do the January 1st, 1997 CNN interview to his former friend Fleet White. Ramsey stated in a 1998 sworn deposition taken during the Stephen Miles lawsuit, Miles, a local photographer who had been charged but not convicted of sexual exploitation of children, sued John Ramsey and the National Enquirer for pointing to him as a likely perpetrator of the crime. That that it was White who had insisted that the family go to CNN to plead their innocence. My review of the records didn't support Ramsey's claim of White's involvement. According to Mary Ann Kempfer, she had overheard Patsy Ramsey participating in a telephone conversation on the morning of January 1st, 1997. Patsy was on a conference call from a phone in Kempfer's bedroom, and they talked once the call had ended. Kempfer reported that family friend Ron Westmoreland was a close friend with the president of CNN, and that he, Westmoreland, had suggested that the family do an interview on cable news network. It was felt that the family had to make some type of public statement to stifle all the other media reports that were speculating about family involvement in the murder of JonBenét. John and Patsy Ramsey subsequently responded to the CNN studios that day, and the interview was broadcast later that night. Nearly everyone in the Paugh household stayed up to watch the broadcast, including Kempfer. The following day, Kempfer indicated during her interview with Boulder investigators that the CNN interview had included a short video clip from inside the Atlanta church that had been recorded during JonBenét's funeral services. Kempfer remarked that she had seen the camera set up in the balcony of the interior of the church. It looked to be a commercial-grade camera versus a small handheld unit that she had seen present at the Boulder services. It is uncertain if this family photographer recording the services for the posterity or if a CNN cameraman had been granted access to the interior of the church to record the events. If that were the case, it would seem that the negotiations for a CNN interview had been ongoing for a little longer than originally indicated, and this footage of the services had been arranged with the intent of being aired during the January 1st interview. John Ramsey's attempt to point the finger of blame at Fleet White for recommending the CNN interview did not appear to be supported by the record. It also appeared that this discussion had been taking place soon after their arrival in Atlanta for JonBenét's services, and material for the interview was being prepared almost immediately. I had also labored under the impression from the beginning of my involvement in the case that the Ramsey family had not hired attorneys and private investigators until Lieutenant Eller had attempted to withhold the body of JonBenét in exchange for a family interview. I had reviewed a VHS tape in the investigative files that featured an interview with the Ramsey family friend and attorney Mike Bunham. Acting as spokesperson for the family, Bunham was speaking on national television in September 1997 and being interviewed by the news correspondent Diane Sawyer, who had asked why the Ramsey's family had obtained a lawyer. Bunham indicated that he, as a family friend, felt that he should have legal advice in the matter of concerning the police investigation into the murder of his daughter. He had mentioned that to John Ramsey because, as a former prosecutor, he knew where the attention of the police would be focused: the parents and family. Sawyer commented that by Saturday, 2 days following the murder, police were openly hostile towards the family. Bunham was reportedly told by the DA's office that the police were refusing to release the body of JonBenét for burial unless the parents would provide interviews with investigators. He wasn't sure if this course of action was legal or not, but pointed to this action as being immoral and unethical. Bunham indicated that he just was not willing to have the family participate in that kind of situation, and told the DA/police that not only would the family not give an interview under these circumstances, but he told them, "Hell no, you're not getting an interview." Investigative files revealed that Eller had not even considered this option until Saturday, December 28th, around the time that non-testimonial evidence was being collected from the immediate family. Even then, it was reported that his thoughts of holding on to the body of JonBenét was not for the intention of holding her for ransom in exchange for a family interview, but to determine if there were any other forensic examinations that could have been conducted that would help shed light on the mechanics of her murder. When Eller had when Eller was discussing this possibility with the DA's office, it was Pete Hofstorm who coined the phrase ransom the body, and this term eventually was espoused by the Ramsey attorneys in later public statements. I found it noteworthy that Bunham specifically stated in the primetime interview that it was he who suggested to John Ramsey that attorneys should be brought in to consult with the family. He expressed the thought to John that there were some legal issues that needed to be taken care of. Bunham went on to indicate that he did not think that it had occurred to the family to do this prior to his conversation with John. Bunham's inference to the national audience during the September 1997 interview, however, was the legal representation had not been retained until after Commander Eller had performed this act of desperation. So you can imagine my surprise when I learned that Ramsey attorneys and their investigators were working the case on Friday morning before the autopsy of JonBenét was even underway. Even more intriguing was the identity of the person selected for their first interview. It was not housekeeper Linda Hoffman Pugh, the woman who Patsy had named as a possible suspect, a person who had needed money and who had previously mentioned concerns about the kidnapping of JonBenét. Ramsey's attorney instead chose the trusted family friend Fleet White, one of the few who had immediately been summoned to the Ramsey home on the morning of the kidnapping, and the only individual who had accompanied John Ramsey to the basement in the search of JonBenét. Of all the people initially named as possible suspects by the Ramseys, what could Fleet White possibly know about the kidnapping and murder of JonBenét? Moreover, why would it be so important that he, as a material witness to the discovery of JonBenét's body, be interviewed before the cause and manner of her death had been determined? I realized that attempts to interview the housekeeper could have interfered with the police investigation, but it did not preclude the Ramsey's team from running their own parallel investigation and interviewing other material witnesses. John Ramsey continued to shield that information and conveniently sidestepped a question about attorney involvement posed by Lou Smith during their June 1998 interview. They were discussing events that were taking place on the evening of Friday, December 27, 1996, when the Ramsey family was staying at the Fernie residence. According to John Ramsey, Mike Bunham had delivered food to the residence while Sergeant Mason and Detective Arndt were there attempting to arrange a follow-up interview with the family. Smith asked if that had been the first time that he, John Ramsey, had contacted a lawyer. Ramsey replied that Bunham just happened to be there delivering food from Pasta J's and called a timeout when police were trying to haul them down to the station for questioning. Bunham, according to John Ramsey's statement to Smith, reportedly took him aside and asked him if he would allow him to do some things that he thought were necessary. Ramsey agreed, and Bunham and Ramsey claimed that it was after this conversation that Bunham reportedly brought attorneys Brian Morgan and Pat Burke into the case. This statement clearly does not account for the fact that the Ramsey's attorneys had actually been attempting to reach Fleet White on the very afternoon of the discovery of JonBenét's body and were seeking to interview him first thing the next day on Friday morning. According to White, he had driven to Denver on Friday morning to conduct some personal business. His wife Priscilla advised him upon his return early that afternoon that Ramsey's attorneys had again been trying to reach him that morning and wanted to speak with him. The interview was held later that day in the Boulder law offices of Brian Morgan, and private investigator David Williams was present taking notes. More recently, John Ramsey provided a description of how attorneys became involved in his book, The Other Side is Suffering, which significantly differs from the explanation he provided to Lou Smith and what Mike Bunham reported during his primetime live TV interview. In the latest version, John Ramsey states that he received a telephone call from a friend at his office on the day after JonBenét was murdered. This person told him that they had been asked to get a message to him. The message was as following: "The police are out to get you. The police think you murdered JonBenet." Ramsey went on to state that the person warning him had received a call from a reliable person inside the system, and that they had recommended he get the best defense attorney to represent him as possible. Ramsey indicated that the idea that police would suspect him of being responsible for the murder of his daughter was insane, but now was offering this as a reason why criminal defense attorneys had been hired by the family so early on in the investigation. In his opinion, the caller had been correct. He had believed Boulder police began to focus their attention on him from the early hours of the investigation. It was this insider's tip that forced him to engage the services of an attorney to defend him and his family. This latest explanation of how attorneys became involved again appears to be in conflict with the information I had reviewed about the matter. If this information is taken at face value, however, it opens up a Pandora's box of other issues. The day after JonBenet's murder, the coroner's office spent most of the day performing the autopsy on her body. A break in the autopsy protocol took place that afternoon when Dr. Mayer called together the Boulder County Child Fatality Review Team. As noted in a previous chapter, the team had collectively established a list of things for Boulder police and DSS investigators to pursue in their search for possible explanations of the evidence that suggested prior sexual abuse. At that stage of the game, anything was possible, and I didn't see anything in the official reports that suggested the focus of the investigation was centering on John Ramsey. So, from my perspective, his reference to a telephone call made to him on the day after his daughter's murder raises some additional questions. Who was this reliable insider who purportedly wanted to get the urgent message to John Ramsey? At what point from the insider's view on the matter did they decide that John Ramsey needed a criminal defense attorney? Was it when the search warrants for the house were being drafted on the afternoon of the discovery of JonBenet's body? Or was it when the evidence of prior sexual abuse became apparent during her autopsy the following day? Moreover, if she or he truly does exist, is it the same individual who is sharing Lou Smith's intruder evidence with the Ramsey defense team in advance of the Ramseys' April 1997 interview? This situation gave me pause and raised for the following red flags. Why would John Ramsey feel the need to conceal the details about the timeline of his attorney's first involvement in this investigation? Why would his original explanation of an attorney involvement change between 1998 and 2012? Was he compelled to safeguard this information from the public because he believed it would somehow be detrimental to his cause? Additionally, I found it difficult to swallow the Ramseys' response to the question raised during their April 1997 interviews with the Boulder Police Department investigators. Both John and Patsy had been asked during their interviews if they had the opportunity to review police reports that had been provided to them in advance of the interview. Patsy indicated that she had not reviewed the materials, and John stated that he had only scanned the reports prior to his sit-down with authorities. I found these responses implausible under the circumstances. $500 per hour defense attorneys don't negotiate and demand copies of police reports and witness statements prior to an interview unless they intend to go through them with a fine-tooth comb as they prepare their clients for questioning. By the time the Ramseys sat down for their first uninterrupted interview with the detectives investigating the death of their daughter, you can rest assured that each of them was very well rehearsed and prepared for the questions that would be posed to them. There were a couple of other behavioral clues exhibited by John Ramsey on the morning of the kidnapping that appeared out of sync with the circumstances at hand. At one point that morning, while the family and police investigators still awaited a ransom call, Pilot Mike Arucula volunteered to fly to Minnesota to intercept the commercial jet carrying Melinda and Stuart, the suggestion being that he could quickly meet the kids and to ferry them back to Boulder, thus avoiding the hassle of their having to arrange a new commercial flight to Denver. John Ramsey had nixed the idea, and I wondered why he didn't want to take advantage of his pilot's offer to shortcut the uncertainty of availability of flights that would divert the kids to Colorado. I gave thought to the idea that perhaps he had declined this offer because he wanted to be assured that his private plane was accessible for a quick departure from the state. What came later seemed to confirm that piece of speculation. It seemed incomprehensible to me that John Ramsey, within less than an hour of the discovery of the body of his daughter, would be making arrangements to take his family and leave the state by private plane. When overheard making these arrangements with his pilot, Ramsey told Detective Bill Palmer that he had an important business meeting to attend in Georgia. Like many of the Boulder investigators, I pondered the question: how could a business meeting in Georgia outweigh the need to work with authorities in their attempt to identify the person who had just murdered his daughter? Red flag. Why was John Ramsey so anxious to leave the state? Yeah, Mr. Ramsey. I subscribe to the notion that for the most part, as human beings, we tend to act instinctively in certain situations. It is part of the survival instinct of human fight or flight response that has been programmed into our genes over the millennia. There was one other major discrepancy discovered by investigators, and they continued to evaluate John Ramsey's behavior and statements. Stuart Long had arrived at the Ramsey home in a taxi with his fiancée Melinda and John Andrew, just as police were clearing the house for search warrant following the discovery of John Benet's body. All three of the older kids joined the family in a vehicle and headed to the home of John and Barbara Fernie. As they departed the area, John Ramsey told Lang that he had found John Benet's body at 11 a.m. that morning. Long recounted this conversation with Detective Thomas when interviewed as part of the follow-up investigation. Thomas, knowing that Ramsey had gone to the basement at the request of Detective Arndt at 1 p.m. that day, pressed Long on his recollection of time of discovery as stated by John Ramsey. Long was adamant that Ramsey had stated that he had found John Benet at 11 o'clock that morning. Considering the timeline of events, this was smack dab in the middle of the time frame during which John Ramsey had disappeared from Detective Linda Arndt's view, and a full 2 hours before she had directed him to search the house. The red flag here was that John Ramsey stated the timing of the discovery of the body of his daughter. If this was not just a miscommunication and he had truly found her body 2 hours before he had been directed to check the home, why didn't he immediately reveal this critical discovery to the police detective on the scene? What could have accounted for his decision to delay telling authorities about the finding of the body of John Benet? Barbara Fernie had raised another red flag when she decided to contact investigators in early January 1998. She and her son had seen photographs of golf clubs in a tabloid story about John Benet while shopping in a grocery store, and her son recognized the set of clubs as belonging to Burke. The sight of the golf club spurred her memory about an odd comment that John Ramsey had made to someone while the family was staying at the Fernie residence after the discovery of John Benet's body. It was this time frame that the authorities had granted permission for Pam Pa, Patsy's visiting sister from Georgia, to enter the Ramsey home and to retrieve a number of John Benet's personal belongings. This was during the time that investigators were still processing the crime scene for evidence, and the Ramsey family was permitted to access and gather some items that were intended for the funeral services being arranged in Georgia. Mrs. Fernie recalled that John Ramsey had asked a strange question of a person stopping by her home one evening. He asked if they remembered to get his golf bag from his house. that golf bag though. Mrs. Fernie recalled that individual replied that they had not been able to retrieve the bag as the police would not let them downstairs. Given the emotional condition of everyone in her home after JonBenét's murder, John Ramsey's request for his golf clubs seemed out of the ordinary to her. His daughter had just been murdered, and it was the dead of winter in Colorado. For what purpose would he be asking for his golf bags to be retrieved from his house? The red flag waving for me was this. I doubted Ramsey was planning to play a round of 18 holes at any time in the near future, even in Atlanta, and I wondered if he were interested in the retrieval of this golf bag because it contained something other than sporting equipment. Mrs. Fernie shared one additional tidbit of information with investigators that had been bothering her. She indicated that late in the summer, on the early fall of 1996, she had observed damages to the latch area of the exterior screen door located on the rear south side of the Ramsey home. Mrs. Fernie was concerned that perhaps a burglary attempt had been made to the home and shared this information with Patsy. They inspected the door and determined that the interior door exhibited no damages whatsoever. Patsy expressed no concern about the damaged screen door and suggested that perhaps John was responsible for the marks. He reportedly was always forgetting his keys and had broken into the house on other occasions. Mrs. Fernie indicated that she had seen a photograph of this same screen door displayed in an advertisement running in one of the Denver newspapers shortly after the murder. The advertisement, placed by Ramsey attorneys and taking up at least half of the page of the newspaper, purported that this may have been a possible point of entry used in the kidnapping of JonBenét. This did not sit well with Mrs. Fernie because Patsy was fully aware that these damages had been inflicted upon the screen door weeks or months prior to the murder of JonBenét. The use of this particular photograph seemed to be an attempt to mislead the public about evidence associated with the crime, and the Fernies indicated that they had severed their contact with the family following their observation of the advertisement. They sketch. That's what she said. That's what they did. I don't blame them. There were other behavioral aspects of Patsy Ramsey's actions that didn't quite ring true to me and that seemed out of sync for the circumstances. For example, Patsy indicated during interviews that she initially was confused about whether the ransom note was referring to JonBenét or John's oldest daughter, Beth. This didn't quite make sense because Beth had been killed in a traffic accident a couple years prior to the kidnapping. In any event, Patsy stated that she never finished reading more than the first few lines of the ransom note and immediately went on to check JonBenét's room. Opening the door of the bedroom, Patsy stated that she did not see JonBenét in her bed and had immediately screamed John's name. It did not make sense to me that a mother would not have screamed her daughter's name and searched the room for her. In spite of the presence of a ransom note, maternal instinct and stress of the moment should have sent her beyond the threshold of the door and into the entire bedroom and bathroom. Not finding her there, I would have expected a search to have been made of Burke's room and that he would have been awakened and asked if he knew of his sister's whereabouts. The Ramseys stated publicly on more than one occasion that Burke was asleep, and they never asked him if he had seen JonBenét or whether he had heard anything unusual that night. More importantly, what parents would not be screaming their child's name as they searched the house for her? Chris Watts didn't scream names when he looked for his family. Just saying. It was only Fleet White who stated that he had called for JonBenét as he checked the house after being summoned to the home that morning. This specific behavior on the part of the parents lacked a certain legitimacy for me, as I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but Patsy's accounting of these events on their first nationally televised interviews seemed scripted. I was also perplexed by Patsy's behavior exhibited upon the discovery of JonBenét's body. As noted in police report, Fleet White charged up from the basement shouting for someone to call an ambulance after he and John Ramsey had found JonBenet's body in the wine cellar. In this setting, I think it's responsible to presume that most of us would be thinking someone was injured and in need of immediate medical attention. Why else would White be shouting for an ambulance? Apparently, Barb Fernie and Priscilla White thought the same thing, for they immediately rushed out of the solarium to see what was going on. Not Patsy Ramsey, however. According to Detective Arndt's reporting of the events, the mother of the missing and kidnapped child remained in the solarium during all of this commotion, and it was not until she directed John to retrieve his wife did she enter the living room to encounter the lifeless body of her daughter. In Patsy's interview, conducted on April 30th, 1997, she stated that she heard White's screams for an ambulance. She kept saying, "What is it? What is it?" but never took the initiative to leave the room to find out. She claimed to have been restrained in the solarium by family friend Barbara Fernie. A big red flag flew up the pole on this particular behavioral clue. I would have expected a mother to have rushed into the fray to determine if her child had been found and to be asking why an ambulance was being called to her home. I didn't believe anyone would have been able to hold back a mother under these circumstances. To me, Patsy Ramsey's actions in this specific instance were counterintuitive. So under those circumstances, I ask myself, why did Patsy remain behind in the solarium when Fleet White was shouting for an ambulance? Was it because she already knew that her daughter was dead? If this was the case, how did she come to know that information? Further, if she already knew her daughter's death, did she play a role in that crime? In our constitutional system of jurisprudence, people are presumed innocent until proven otherwise. It is the responsibility of the defense attorney to represent their client's best interest, and this necessarily requires them to make the prosecution prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. One of the tactics commonly used by the defense bar is to counsel their client to deny at the outset any and all accusations of criminal conduct. In their attempt to divert attention away from the actual conduct and the behavior of their client, defense attorneys are forever searching for plausible deniability and circumstances that muddy the waters. When the facts are in dispute, the first line of the defense is frequently to deny, deny, deny. When the facts are incontrovertible, then it is time to move to the next tactic, raise questions about the process by which those facts were established. It is their intention to undermine the foundation of the presentation of physical evidence that would be used at a trial, succeed at throwing out the defendant's bloody fingerprints found at the scene crime, and it is likely that no conviction will follow. If those first two tactics were not successful, the next strategic move is to attack the honor and credibility of the men and women who are tasked with seeking the truth on the matter. I think I'm too young to be buying into John Ramsey's bullshit. Like, that's, I don't know, man. Ugh. Evidence linking the defendant to the crime was planted. I want to read that again. If the first two tactics were not successful, the next strategic move is to attack the honor and credibility of the men and women who are tasked with seeking the truth on the matter. Evidence linking the defendant to the crime was planted, and the cops are lying about investigative procedures, or, as witnessed in JonBenet's case, Boulder police lack the expertise to investigate a murder case on their own. We witnessed the successful implementation of these tactics in the O.J. Simpson trial, and I thought it curious that Patsy Ramsey would specifically refer to the O.J. situation during her CNN interview. To place this in perspective, Brian Cabell had offered the following observation during the interview. Cabell: inevitably, speculation on talk shows will focus on you. It's got to be sickening. John Ramsey: it's nauseating, beyond belief. Patsy Ramsey: you know, America has just been hurt so badly with the tragic things that have happened. The young woman who drove her children into the water, and we don't know what happened with the O.J. Simpson. And I mean, America is suffering because we lost faith in the American family. We are a Christian, God-fearing family. We love our children, and we will do anything for our children. Patsy Ramsey's reference to high-profile murder cases was intriguing, and I wondered why she had chosen those two cases in particular. Why not summon remembrances of the horrific crimes committed by the likes of Son of Sam, Jeffrey Dahmer, or Theodore Bundy? The public sentiment following O.J.'s acquittal seemed to be one of astonishment. The dream team of defense attorneys had completely twisted the physical evidence collected in the case and focused their attention on the destruction of the credibility of investigators of the crime. Their arguments ultimately set O.J. free, but a civil jury would not be so easily misled. In the case of Susan Smith, Patsy was calling into her court of cold-blooded details of a South Carolina mother who had intentionally driven her two young boys into a lake and left them to drown. Susan then concocted the story of a carjacking and proceeded to blame a mysterious black man for the crime. She shed plenty of tears during her broadcast television interviews and pleaded with the public to help track down the kidnapper who had taken her children from her. The deception of Susan Smith would not survive the skepticism of investigators, however, and she ultimately confessed her sins to Union County Sheriff Howard Wells. The black carjacker who had kidnapped her children was non-existent, and it was Susan who had driven her two young boys into the lake and left them to drown. In my viewing, Susan Smith's tearful pleas for help were strangely reminiscent of Patsy's accounting of events on CNN, and I couldn't help but feel that there was a similarity between the two events. Patsy Ramsey's proclamation of innocence due to her God-fearing Christian status seemed too convenient. It was this type of alibi often used by those attempting to divert attention from their guilt, and was a classic material drawn from the text of police interrogation manuals. The argument being, a loving Christian family would be incapable of committing horrendous crimes of violence. For those crime historians among you, I suspect that this line of reasoning holds little weight, for our prisons are full of Christian convicted for their participation in similar crimes of violence. More to the point, Patsy's spontaneous reference to those two murder cases gave me pause. In her prescription-induced medicated state, was she subconsciously aligning herself with people who had brutally murdered members of their own family? I looked to the possibility that this dialogue consisted of a spontaneous utterance, and unguarded words we speak sometimes reveal the workings of our internal thoughts. Detective Steve Thomas had made note of an additional utterance made by Patsy during the collection of the non-testimonial evidence on Saturday, December 28, 1996. To put the statement in perspective, I cited the entry from his book, JonBenét Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. That's one of our books, guys. Let's get it. Patsy was unsteady as I had her lift the sleeves of her loose denim blouse so that I could check her for bruises or scratches on the fronts and the backs of her arms. Then I checked her face and the neck and found nothing unusual. We were standing in a row at the counter with Patsy in the middle, and when she shifted slightly and whispered to Detective Gossage, "Will this help find who killed my baby?" he carefully replied equally softly, "I hope so." Patsy looked at her inked fingers and spoke again. I did not kill my baby. The Ramsey lawyer apparently did not hear her, but my head snapped around as if on a swivel. The Colorado revised the statute procedure 41.1 spelled out that we couldn't ask investigative questions during this evidence collection, but we could certainly listen if there was something said voluntarily, and the mother of the murder victim had blurted out something totally unexpected. I directed my comment to Gossage. What did she just say? Patsy repeated to me this time. I did not kill my baby. The lawyer lurched away from the wall, placing his hands on her shoulders, brought his face within inches of her ear, and whispered empathetically. She didn't say another word during the entire session, but what she had already said hung like thunder. I did not kill my baby. No one had suggested that she had. There were a couple of red flags raised in this instance. The first being that John Ramsey and his attorneys had continued to characterize this December 28th meeting with Boulder Police as an interview and evidence of their continuing cooperation in the investigation. For the lay of public, it is important to understand that this collection of non-testimonial physical evidence could be viewed as cooperation, but is in no way should it be construed as an interview with authorities. That's page 333, bruh. For the attorneys and private investigators accompanying the Ramseys on that day made certain no interview or testimonial evidence would be collected by police investigators, and I viewed the Ramseys' representations of cooperations as a continuing part of their media spin. Why would they strive to buttress the perception that the parents had been cooperating with authorities when clearly they halted any productive communications with Boulder investigators as soon as they left their home on the afternoon of December 26, 1996. Secondarily, Patsy Ramsey was stating to investigators that she did not kill her baby. At that point in time, Boulder investigators were still gathering facts and had no clue as to who had actually been involved in the murder of JonBenét. Her ransom note had been left by her kidnappers, and evidence of her restraint and abduction were readily apparent. Why would Patsy feel it necessary to proclaim her innocence in the death of her daughter? Spontaneous utterances can take many forms, and by way of further example, I refer to the well-publicized California murder investigation involving the family of Scott and Lacey Peterson. Hi, Lacey. Scott had uttered an interesting question during his conversations with the detective who was investigating the disappearance of his pregnant wife. When advised that the police department had been using K-9 teams to assist the investigation, Scott asked if they had used the cadaver dogs yet. The questions gave the detectives pause. Why would Scott ask if a dog trained in the recovery of dead bodies was being brought into an investigation? At that early point in the inquiry, Lacey Peterson was only thought to be overdue and missing. What possible benefit would a cadaver dog bring to an investigation? The spontaneous utterance was a red flag for the investigator, and this statement, combined with the many other behavioral clues discovered during their investigation, proved to be instrumental in helping prove Scott Peterson's consciousness of guilt at trial. Another illustration of spontaneous utterance involves a sexual assault investigator that I directed in the 1990s. I referred to some aspects of this investigation in other portions of this book, but the specific reference to be made here is with regard to the statements made by the suspect, who became the primary focus of our pursuit for the perpetrator. We'd obtained a court order for the collections of non-testimonial evidence in the case, i.e. blood samples, that would be compared against the DNA evidence left at the scene of the assault. When served with the notice of the 441.1 court order demanding his compliance in the collection of this physical evidence, the suspect read over the cover page of the warrant and uttered the following words. "First-degree assault? No way! First degree?" I viewed these spontaneous comments as representative of his consciousness of guilt. Though not stated, he apparently thought that the commission of this residential burglary and rape constituted the crime of a second or third degree sex assault, and that our warrant had it all wrong. There was good reason that this suspect had flunked out of a self-sponsored student of a police academy, and the evidence collected in our court order eventually sealed his fate. He subsequently entered a plea of guilty to this crime and served 11 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. We are all creatures of habit, and the fact that the ransom note had been written on Patsy's personal notepad served to drive this home for me as one more red flag that needed to be considered. Under the stress of the moment, confronted with the sudden and violent death of her daughter, I wondered whether Patsy, if she were the writer of the note, had failed to consider the possibility of finding a different pad of paper and pen when it came time to craft the evidence of a kidnapping. She would have been acting as she normally did when writing something down, grabbing her own pad and felt tip pen that she frequently used over the course of her daily activities. While thought was being given as to how attention could be diverted away from the family, another key detail was overlooked as the staging of the crime scene took place. I don't know exactly how many pads of paper were available in the home that day, but I had to wonder what the odds would be that an intruder had located her pad of paper to write the ransom note, and then that the handwriting experts would be unable to eliminate Patsy as the author. Boulder investigators had located the pad in the rear kitchen hallway and the Sharpie pen that had eventually been identified as the instrument used to write the note, and it was in a cup below the kitchen phone Patsy had used to call 911. They thought the note had been crafted shortly before the 911 call to authorities, hence the placement of the pen near the phone. I am certain that many of those in the reading audience would think of the many habits and routines that have become part of your daily existence. Do you always start shaving on the same side of your face? Does the right shoe always go on before the left? Do you drive on the same path to work every day, even when another route may be available? It takes some conscious effort to alter those activities, but when stress is added to the equation, we frequently fall back on what we are used to doing, primarily because the habit has served us well. Take an example of police firearms training. There is an old axiom that has developed over the years, and it is this: we are likely to perform in the field as we train in the classroom. Several decades ago, investigators were sometimes confronted with trying to figure out why an officer involved in a shooting incident took the time to retrieve the spent shell casings dumped near their revolver, all while engaging in the heat of a gunfire with the bad guys. In a number of instances, officers fatally wounded during the exchange of gunfire were found to have their own empty shell casings in their pockets. Investigators were stumped. What could possibly be the reasons for an officer engaged in a deadly gun battle to take the time to collect his empty brass? It soon became apparent that the officers acting under the duress of the moment had merely been acting on behavior that had been ingrained during the many hours of firearms trainings. In some jurisdictions, it is routine to immediately collect your empty brass after you fired your weapon at a paper target. It made for an easier cleanup at the end of the day at a range. Training soon adapted to this realization, and spent brass stayed where it fell at the end of the day. Officers fatally wounded in the shootouts no longer were being found with empty shell casings in their pockets. It was my thought that this combination of things taking place in regards to the ransom note pointed to a matter of habit and routine. As hard as Patsy may have tried to alter the crime scene, she had not been able to overcome the habit of using her own notepad when it came time to craft a ransom note left behind by the intruder. The same could be said for her pronunciation, use of language, and style of handwriting. Investigators frequently look to post-offense behavioral changes when attempting to narrow a list of suspects believed responsible for the crime. In this instance, Boulder Police Department investigators could not understand why the Ramsey family had taken refuge behind a wall of attorneys so early in the investigation. They had expected the family to be pounding down the doors, wanting information about the status of the search for their daughter's killer. Soon after the burial of their daughter, Patsy seemed to be suggesting that she was interested in learning where investigators stood in their progress. During the conversation held with Mary Kempfer, who had played nanny to Burke and her son, Anthony, during the funeral services held in Atlanta, Patsy stated that she had wanted to know why they had not heard from the Boulder police about the case. She wondered what progress had been made and was frustrated about not knowing anything. A day or so later, after watching their CNN interview on television, Patsy commented on the news coverage that reported a group of Boulder detectives were boarding flights for Atlanta. Patsy was reportedly observed to have turned to her husband to ask, "So, are we going to have company tomorrow?" John responded, "I guess." I thought it ironic that she was voicing frustration about the lack of knowledge on the status of the investigation and could have easily made arrangements to receive a briefing from Boulder authorities after their arrival in Georgia. Instead, John and Patsy Ramsey quietly slipped out of the state and took refuge in the Colorado home of their family friend, Pasta J. Olowski. Patsy's interest in learning about the status of progress in the investigation and her husband's willingness voiced during the CNN interview to return to Colorado and to work with the police seemed to quickly have dissipated. Another piece of post-offense behavior noted by investigators centered on Patsy Ramsey's sudden change in handwriting techniques. In April 1997, Detective Steve Thomas and Ron Gossage paid a surprise visit to the Georgia home of Nedra Pugh, Patsy Ramsey's mother. Mr. and Mrs. Pugh were not particularly happy to see investigators, and they reportedly gave an earful about how they thought the Boulder police were persecuting their daughter. At one point in the discussion centered on the ransom note, Detective Gossage indicated that Mrs. Pugh believed her daughter had not authored the note, and that perhaps she would be willing to provide some handwriting examples to help investigators clear her of possible involvement. Mrs. Pugh responded by thrusting a piece of paper into the detective's hands, stating that her daughter had just written on that this morning. After departing the residence, Gossage noted that the piece of paper contained a list of handwritten names, addresses, and telephone numbers. Gossage further observed that the second letter A in the name Barbara Fernie had originally been written in manuscript style, but had been written over with a black felt tip pen, changing it to a cursive style letter. Investigators noted that the ransom note contained a total of 376 words, and a smaller letter A had been printed in a manuscript style 109 times and written in lowercase cursive style only 5 times. This was clear evidence that the author of the note was attempting to conceal his or her handwriting style in order to be precluded from being identified. Unwillingly, Nedra Pugh had provided investigators a sampling of Patsy Ramsey's handwriting that indicated that she consciously was making attempts to change her handwriting style. Investigators noted that Patsy Ramsey's pre-homicide pre-homicide writings that she had consistently used a lowercase manuscript style A in her handwriting. In her post-offense samplings, however, Patsy Ramsey's writing of the manuscript style of the letter A disappeared entirely. Investigators believe the evidence pointed to conscious efforts on her part to obscure her style of handwriting. It is this type of post-offense behavioral change that investigators are looking for when evaluating evidence of the suspect's possible involvement in a criminal offense. Patsy Ramsey's conscious efforts to alter her handwriting and style suggested she wrote the ransom note and had some type of participation or knowledge about the circumstances of the death of JonBenét. There had been another discrepancy in one of Patsy Ramsey's law enforcement interviews that caught my attention. Investigators had noted that the wrapping paper on a pair of Christmas presents observed in the wine cellar at the time of the discovery of JonBenét's body had been turned. She had told the investigator she couldn't remember what was contained in the presents and hence needed to tear back that part of the paper. Maybe a sibling said that Santa had more presents down in the basement. I learned over the course of my inquiry that it was Burke who had actually been responsible for tearing back the paper of the presents while playing in the basement on Christmas Day, and I wondered why Patsy would claim responsibility for doing this. Patsy had also told investigators that the unwrapped box of Lego toys in the same room was being hidden for Burke's upcoming January birthday. Happy birthday, Burke. I didn't give much thought about the presence of this Christmas presents in the room at the time, but would later think these played a role in some of the events that took place on Christmas Day. It was reported that information about the investigative steps being taken by Boulder police investigators was leaking like a sieve to both of the Ramseys camp and media. It seemed that any tidbit of information, whether it be of substance or not, was being devoured by the press. In one instance early on in the investigation, a tabloid offered $30,000 for copies of the ransom note that had not yet been released to the public. Information about one critical piece of evidence was Patsy's hands before she interviewed with the DA's office in June 1998. It was not clear how she came to know this, but it was apparent that she was aware that a pineapple had been found in the digestive tract of her daughter. Armed with this knowledge, she denied feeding the pineapple to her daughter or knowing how it may have entered her system. Through questioning, Patsy had indicated that she had cleaned up the kitchen and dining room after their late Christmas morning pancake breakfast. She didn't think the family had had lunch that day due to the late breakfast and the fact that they were going to the Whites that afternoon for a dinner party. Shown photographs of the dining room table held a glass with a tea bag and a bowl of pineapple and a spoon. Patsy declared that someone else had to have placed those items there. Her reasoning for believing this was that she would never put a spoon that big in a bowl like that. At first view of the photograph, she stated that she couldn't tell what the contents in the bowl were, suggesting that they were grits or apples or cereal. Patsy continued to maintain that JonBenét was sound asleep when the family returned home from the White dinner party and that she had not served pineapple to her daughter. There was some brief discussion about the Whites not serving pineapple at their party, so the investigator was trying to pin down the time and location of JonBenét may have had access to this fruit. Patsy stuck by her story and further stated that she did not believe that it was possible that either of her kids had gotten up that night to fix themselves a snack because she would have heard the kitchen cupboards being opened and closed. She suggested that the person who had murdered her daughter was responsible for feeding her the pineapple and that this had actually happened when he was in the home that evening. I took this to mean that she believed the intruder had been a little more careful about opening and closing the cupboard doors as he prepared the snack for JonBenét. Patsy had at one point asked if the bowl and glass had been fingerprinted, and when told the latent fingerprints had been identified as belonging to one of them, John and Patsy, she continued to deny knowledge about the dinnerware found on the dining room table. I did not feed JonBenét pineapple, okay? I don't know how it got in her stomach, and I don't recall where this bowl of pineapple came from. I can't recall putting that there, and I never recall putting a tea bag like that in a cup. It is important to note that investigators determined that the Whites had not served pineapple during their dinner party. Moreover, that by the time of this interview, investigators developed latent fingerprints on the drinking glass and the dining room table, and that they belonged to Burke. Latent fingerprints found on the bowl of the pineapple were identified as belonging to Patsy. Assuming the bowl had been washed before use, this was proof that linked Patsy to a tangible piece of physical evidence that played an important role in this murder. The timing of the ingestion of these pieces of fruit placed in JonBenét at the home of the Whites' dinner party, having consumed it approximately 2 hours before her strangulation at approximately 1 a.m. JonBenét may very well have been asleep when the family arrived home that evening, but it is plausible to believe that she had ventured downstairs sometime later that night. The red flag in this instance addresses Patsy's adamant denial of having anything to do with the glass of tea and the bowl of pineapple discovered on the dining room table. And yet the physical evidence in this instance suggested she had served the bowl of pineapple to Burke after returning home from the Whites' dinner party. Was Patsy denying the activity because the pineapple in JonBenét's digestive system provides evidence of contact between Burke and his sister at a critical time? I believe she gave voice to a specific motive on the day she accompanied Burke to the DSS interview that was conducted on January 8, 1997. Speaking with Detective Arndt as Burke was being interviewed by Dr. Bernard, Patsy stated that she would have nothing left to live for if she lost Burke. Was this a spontaneous utterance that betrayed a motivation for a lack of candor about this crime? In my view, these were questions that required further consideration. In fact, from my perspective, the entirety of this investigation was awash in a sea of red flags. And yet, remarkably, there were additional discoveries that would be made more than 13 years after the murder of this little girl. You know, America has just been hurt so deeply with the tragic things that have happened. The young woman who drove her children into the water, and we don't know what happened to the O.J. Simpson. And I mean, America is suffering because people had lost faith in the American family. We are a Christian, God-fearing family. We love our children. We would do anything for our children. Patsy Ramsey during the January 1st, 1997 CNN interview. We're on page 344. I got my first job offer today, and then I had a job interview this morning. I just wanted to say thank you for being here, guys. Okay.